Eritrea was an incredible experience for me personally, and I think for the whole group. It was really set out as a class to deal with conflict and resolution, but my personal perspective was how can you integrate some of our OD tools, OD perspective, organization development, knowledge management, into a much larger scale, at a national scale, and even on the world stage. And it was quite interesting when I started to add my perspectives to the traditional conflict and resolution perspectives of the other co-students in the class. We really were able to create something amazing together. So I'm inviting you into that journey today. I'm going to just touch very, very gently on polarity model, because that was really a helpful tool for me to even get a grasp on what I saw and how I could make sense of it. And I'm going to also introduce archetypes as a way of unlocking situations and dynamics. But I'm going to keep those parts very, very brief. So just to give you an idea on where Eritrea even is, because it's a very small country and I can't just assume that everybody knows. So Eritrea is located right next to Sudan and Ethiopia at a very globally important junction, because the Red Sea is one of the most busiest trade waterways of the world. So much of Eritrea's fate also was connected to this body of water. So in the earliest centuries, you had a lot of trade come in, you had a lot of change of ruling or change of rulers on the coastline. But then later on, in the last 150 years, it really became a detriment to the country or to the region and to the people who live there, because there were Italians had occupancy for 50 years, and from 1890 to 1940, then the British came in. Then there was a struggle with Ethiopia, because as you can see, Ethiopia is landlocked, and a large country really wanted to have access to the water, so there was a lot of conflict there, just based on the geographic location of the country. And this is just a little bit more of a snapshot of the actual country. So we were mainly operating in the Asmara, which is the capital, and I didn't know until we got there, but or shortly before we got there, it's 2,500 meters, so over 7,000 feet elevation. And from here to Massawa, to the port, is about only 80 miles as the crow flies. So there's incredible mountains. All of this is a high plateau, very fertile, very green when the rain comes, and it's just absolutely stunning and magnificent. We took trips to Karen, we visited battlefields at the Ethiopian border, and we went to Massawa. So those were just geographically, so that you have an idea where we were. So I looked at it, or what we heard before we even went, is a whole bunch of narratives about Eritrea. And what we heard was, oh, it's a totalitarian regime, it's compared to the North Korea of Africa, very suppressive, very restrictive, and very narrow-minded. Of course, there's the narrative of the poor third world nation. So, when you visit a nation like that, it's a lot of times when people come from the outside, especially with a lighter skin color, you have the white savior syndrome, where you say, oh, you come in and you just fix all of their problems. So I wanted to be very, very cognizant of that notion before I traveled. And of course, there's media pictures of war and of famine that are quite jarring. So all of that, of course, I carry with me before I even touch the ground. And I wanted to be very, I wanted to reconcile. And that was kind of my whole intention of traveling there, to see what are stories about somebody or an organization, a country, a nation, and what are stories and narratives that are discoverable, that may or may not confirm or reject or alter the narratives that are out there. So these are just a couple of impressions, and so this is with the Independence Avenue. You can kind of sense a little bit the Italian influence with the palm trees. A lot of the stores still are reminiscent of Italian heritage, so they have the best gelato in the capital. really, really great dishes. So from a cultural perspective, really interesting. And then most of the buildings that were built around the 1920s, 1930s, the Italian architects came there and built stuff that they weren't allowed to build at home. So they were super futuristic and super, like, very cutting edge for the time. They built like this big building that looks like an ocean liner. They built a building that looks like an airplane. All the stuff that you would never be able to allow them to build in Rome at the time, you know, they kind of came and they practiced and they did all that. And it's quite interesting. So from a cultural perspective, it's just a lot of things to discover. So this is the airplane building. You kind of see the, you know, the wings going to the side, and they're totally unsupported. So when you think about when it was built and the architectural feat of the time with using steel construction and static was quite amazing. And at one point, towards the latter trip of a friend of mine, or well, I call her a friend now, of course, we actually managed to climb all the way to the top of the building and had a beautiful view over the whole Capitol. And then those balconies that you see on the other side are just another expression of a mix of the futuristic design, of Mediterranean flair, but it all fits into an existing culture of informed by a very rich Islamic tradition, very rich Christian tradition, and it all blends together, and it's quite beautiful. And one story that we picked up that was very highlighting. So we talked to the cultural, the Ministry of Cultural Heritage. They filed for World Heritage protection. And we asked them, so you're protecting all these buildings that are really representative for colonialization. So how do you reconcile that for you? And he actually started to laugh, and he said, you know, we didn't like everything that the Italians did, and that was certainly parts of that history are not, we don't appreciate, but that doesn't prevent us from loving the buildings. It was our grandfathers who built it. We are now living in it, we're now preserving it, and the buildings are us. And I just thought that was such a nice reconciliation of, yes, there was something that was hurtful and that was ugly at the time, but to turn that into something that is of value for you today. And I think that tension, and we heard a little bit of that this morning in the classroom, to be able to hold that tension and not having to choose between either or is quite amazing. So these are just a couple of impressions. Our objective really was to collect stories. So we try to talk to people and not just, and forget what we read about in books or what the media put out on the internet. We really wanted to hear individual stories, and this was a story of a man who was really caught up in the middle of the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia. His family had moved to Ethiopia when he was very little. They built a life there, he built a life there, while the armed struggle was going on. Well, in 1991, when the armed struggle finally finished and a peace agreement or statement was signed, Ethiopia then decided to kick all the Eritreans out. So after he had already built a life for himself in a different country, which shares the same culture, he was displaced in the other direction. And he has since then struggled to really make a life for himself. So he was one of the ones who said, you know, it wasn't that bad under the Italians. At least they knew how to enjoy life, and we have so many beautiful stories from that time. So he was still mourning that a little bit. This is a sassy little girl that we met on the tank graveyard, and she posed for us and did her best superhero moves. And to me, it was just a representation of new life, of we're going to do things maybe different, we're going to have to find our own path, and yes, there's destruction still or signs of it around us, but we have the confidence to just tackle it with pizzazz, and I just absolutely loved meeting. And here, this is kind of representative of how I felt through the whole trip. I looked at Eritrea and said, oh, this is too good to be true, when I looked at all the utopian sounding programs and ideas that they had for their own country. So I'm kind of leaning back and I'm like looking and being skeptical, but then you're also in the story yourself. And so this is one of the school teachers that we met in one of the elementary schools, and then this is the administrator. Still a very much male-dominated society, even though equality is written into their statutes. But it was always the men representing for the community. It was always the men telling us the stories of what was really going on, and we really had to dig deep and draw and invite the female voices in and kind of communicate with them. So that was kind of like sitting on the sideline, but being very alert and watching what's going on was kind of the sense that I picked up from that. This was one of the workers we visited. You see in the background, all of those are man-made terraces, and they cover whole mountainsides. So it can take a village like a whole month to transform an entire mountain into terraces, because when it rains really hard. And in order to prevent soil from washing away and nutrients from washing away and water to disappear too quickly, all of those big mountains are terraced. And there's a new technique that was now introduced, that not only do they build stone walls, all by hand of course. There's little wells dug behind the stone walls, so when the water does run down the mountain, it's being caught, and they can actually use it for farming. And it's young and old in the fields, and it's the whole community taking care of a whole mountain. And this is just to give you a little bit of an impression. This is one of our leaders.
So I was a reporter here in Eritrea during the height of the war, and all of us came in '98, and the rains hadn't come, and we looked around and we saw just a pile of rocks and barren land, and we said, they're just fighting over a bunch of rocks, and how stupid is that? But then the rains came. All of this that you see here that is now under cultivation here, you could see why this was so important. This was the breadbasket of Eritrea, and there was no way that they could lose this land.
So this was another moment of juxtaposition or tension. So as you can see, I mean, you just got a little bit of a glimpse. You have this vast view over this really peaceful looking valley that has the potential to completely transform from a bunch of dust and rubble and rocks into this beautiful fertile farmland. And at the same time, it was a place where, at a very decisive battle, Ethiopia sent over 120,000 troops into that valley. So the whole valley was filled with tanks, with machine guns, fighting against just a couple of hundred of Eritreans up perched on the cliffs. And just standing there and imagining this peaceful valley filled with war, to me was, I don't know, it was just, it made me think. And it was one of those things where you still, again, where you had that tension between a struggle that may or may not have been necessary, because who am I to judge, and the peaceful frame of the land that you see. And this artwork started to become, and as I felt all that tension, and I felt like, to use a metaphor, it felt like a ping pong or a game of ping pong. Here's the good story and here's the bad story, and you follow the ball and you're going like back and forth, and it started to get confusing, and it started to create tension for me. Like, are they really doing what they're saying because it sounds so good, but everybody else says they're just horrible people? Is there really hope here? No, this is just absolute beyond repair. So my thought process was going ping pong all the time, and I really felt like, oh my gosh, I can't ever reconcile that. And it was just this whole wave of energy that wasn't going anywhere. This piece of art could be looked at from different perspectives. When you stood right in front of it, you saw the family with the children. If you stood to the side of it, there were little panels sticking out that were painted. You saw a scene of war. And when you moved over and you looked at it from this side, you had another scene of reconciliation. And to me, that started to symbolize of, all right, I can really stand here and study all the details and learn everything about that one perspective. Or I can move my body and I can move my view, and I may see completely different things. And again, it's not an either or. It's really, you want to ideally you can use both. And this was my day where all of Eritrea really came together for me. So this is in the port of Massawa. You see the old imperial palace from the 700s AD, and just a couple of years ago, it still had a cupola. It was bombed in 99, and it's now completely disappearing because there are no funds there to save the building, really. Right next to it, you have a new hotel that is, built to the standards. And here you have the port of Massawa, which is an exercise of the Eritrean government to open back up to the world and to invite trade in and to hopefully create, looking into the future, to create a connection to the economic wealth of the world. And to me, all of that came together just in that one day. The beauty of the ocean, the history and the rich cultural stories that we heard, the dreams going forward, and trying to reconcile that in a modern world. So what I realized after a while is that this whole trying the either or is absolutely not going to work. And I started to put things out kind of like scattered all over to see patterns. But what happened to me is after I started to see patterns, it was really polarities came into view. And polarity really is the interdependent pairs that support a common purpose. And I love the exercise that we did this morning, because polarity at its simplest example is inhaling and exhaling. You can't just live with one, you need both. And you need to be able to enjoy both parts of it, and only both parts combined give life. And there's a lot of juxtapositioned polarities that we saw on the trip that really you can't do without the other. There needs to be some kind of structure around how do we distribute services to a big country, but there also needs to be freedom for self-expression. So how do you integrate that, and how do you create flow that you can have both without fighting against each other? And that really, to me, is that idea of integration, is as long as, and Susan, you beautifully put that out this morning, as long as you're fighting against something, you create an energy that is conflict-ridden, versus saying, what do I really want, and what are the components that are part of it, and how can I create flow so that all of it is integrated and we can make it one beautiful whole. So that was one part. And here is a beautiful example of exactly that, because you see the solar panel on the old houses. There is so much innovation and so much forward thinking. So that most likely is powering a small light bulb, which at night creates safety, because now people don't just go out in the bush and relieve themselves. The Eritreans actually count all the covered defecation facilities. So even in the villages for health purposes, all of that needed to get structured, right? So you have the solar panels to provide light for at night to go out to the bathroom, but it's also the light by which the children can learn and read their books at night, because during the day they help in the fields. So it's just a beautiful image of integration. You don't have to give up a tradition that you still love because it's part of who you are, yet you can integrate new amenities to it. And then another story typing framework, and I'm going to touch only very briefly on it. I know I'm taking up a lot of time. But story typing is the idea of there are archetypes in us and in the world that relate to each other in different levels. So an archetype, just to pull one out, for example, that is easy to grasp, is a revolutionary. So the revolutionary bumps up against, like, what's wrong here? We need to reform this. This is not working for everybody. And I used those different story types to kind of get an idea of what is the country as a story? What is the country as a character? And what came up for me is that revolutionary You know, we have been left alone by the world. We want to fix what we have. And every person, we want to create social justice for everyone. We want to change the system, but we want to do it our way. And that was really a story that we heard all over and over again, self-reliance and self-determination. So when you put all of the media stories in context with self-determination and self-reliance, a lot of that stuff makes sense. So we can talk about that later if you have questions in more detail. But this to me was then, in the end, the culmination. So this is our study group, and we met in the tank graveyard, and we had a very peaceful debrief session there, really surrounded by all the remnants of war and still the energy in that place. But we were able to reconcile with each other because we all had different stories, and we were able to reconcile, and I fell deeply in love with the country and with the vision that they have for their own people, and hold the tension of both. You know, the oppressing structure on one hand, but social justice and really investing in their own people and in their own infrastructure, their own way, and not what the big world is telling them. So the narrative of Eritrea then for me turned into really a story of social justice and self-reliance, resilience and innovation, and integrative systems thinking. And to me, that turned this whole notion of third world country completely upside down. Because and I'm so thankful for all the reflection exercises that we were invited to do, because when I examined my own thinking, what I realized is that I already carried the white savior syndrome with me. And already in the first, 3, 4, 5 days, I already showed up as, let me see what I can fix here. And what I can offer from my perspective to make this the whole country a better place. How arrogant. Because people who live there and love and have that culture, of course they know what they need and what they want. They may not have the means to get there right now, and there may be opportunity to help and support, but who am I to design a solution for somebody who already knows what it is that they truly need? So the self-reflecting piece in that, to me, was really important, because once I could detect that tape in my head, I could then turn it off, or I could just set it aside and say, yeah, okay, this is the white savior syndrome talking, but now let's just relax and be quiet and listen to what they have to teach me. And I learned a ton. So integrative systems thinking I saw totally at work in Eritrea, and I absolutely loved it, and I hopefully it'll inform my work going forward for a long time.